Alright, order. Next case. Let's see, what do we have here? Some complaints regarding videos on YouTube. I don't need to read this. I know the plaintiff. He's a repeat offender. Guilty. Actually, for kicks and giggles, I will read this case in full. Some complaints regarding videos on YouTube with stupid intros, and my name is on this. Uh-oh. Get that camera out of here! What is up, everybody? RandomRandomMan here. By the way, nice gavel, huh? My brother actually got this for being the captain of his cross-country team in high school, and I hope he doesn't mind that I'm borrowing this. Same thing with his high school graduation robe. Shh. Anyway, RandomRandomMan here, bringing you my review for RBG. Now, the subject matter of this documentary focuses on the life and career of our title figure herself, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, aka RBG, from her humble beginnings in college all the way to her becoming an Associate Justice for the U.S. Supreme Court. Going into this movie, I had some interest to see it. This is yet another movie that premiered at this year's Sundance Film Festival back in January, yet it wasn't this movie's premiere at the Sundance Film Festival that got me hooked. No. What got me intrigued to see it in the first place was actually watching the trailer for it before I saw another movie earlier this year, Flower. I saw a trailer for RBG before that movie, and I had some interest to see it, as I've said. Now, I only knew a little bit about RBG before seeing this documentary. I knew that she was very popular with young people, especially, surprisingly to me. So it had me curious to know where the meme culture that is associated with her came from, and also the life and career of this woman who has made apparently such an impact in today's day and age. I also got a bit more excited to see this documentary because I had recently discovered that this opened up at a local theater of mine, which shocked me because this movie opened in limited release back in early May, and now it was suddenly coming to one of my closest theaters in mid-July now. But no matter, I saw this movie in theaters anyway, and this is only the second ever documentary that I've seen in theaters. Actually, second also within the past few weeks, as recently I've also seen and reviewed the documentary on Mr. Fred Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor, which actually currently stands as my favorite movie of 2018 thus far, in case you didn't know. Also, in relation to Won't You Be My Neighbor, actually, RBG is a bit of a contrast in how it is as a documentary, as this movie has its subject still alive, and she is prominently featured in a bunch of interview sequences throughout this film. So, going into the structure and setup of RBG, it's similar to Won't You Be My Neighbor in that the movie begins talking about the early life of its subject with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and how she was with her childhood and how she would eventually go into college and pursue law. So in that sense, this doc is kind of standard in the way it approaches its subject matter in telling the life story how it is and spotlighting a lot of the notable moments in some big sequences throughout the film. However, the way this movie begins, it also has a little bit of more wit and charm than one would expect with a documentary, especially with a subject matter such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg. One of the first things we see when this documentary begins is Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself working out at a gym, and that immediately gives her a big likability factor for me as somebody who doesn't know that much about her, as this lazy and skinny mofo here is immediately less healthy than her, a woman in her mid-80s, as she is seen working out in a gym and keeping her health up in tip-top shape. That's the personality we immediately get to know RBG to have, in how she is very fierce, very no-nonsense, and determined to put work first and get the most important stuff done. Now, this is backed up by a lot of the talking heads that show up throughout this documentary, which range from some friends, close colleagues, and even some family of RBGs, including her daughter, her son, and her granddaughter, who actually just recently graduated from Harvard Law last year, which shows that the family legacy is continuing. I would say that each person that is interviewed in this movie brings in some nice anecdotal supplements to contribute to how RBG is talked about within her own self, her life story, and specifically to me, to the most notable angle, her romance between her husband Marty. And as that arc is shown throughout this film, I was so touched by it, as I found the romance and marriage between RBG and Marty to be so sweet and cute, just the way it blossomed in how a lot of old archive footage is shown between the two of them, much younger, frolicking around, or just the two of them much later on in life in the same room talking about one another. I was so touched by this. That part was definitely a huge highlight of this documentary for me, as throughout this film as well, the way Marty actually plays into a lot of how RBG's career does play out goes into how after college, RBG got into a lot of court cases in herself being a lawyer and defending a lot of cases that have to do with gender discrimination. Now, that's a big part of what RBG has done over the past few decades in progressing the country forward, as she took on cases that sought to end gender discrimination but also show both sides in how discriminating against not just women, but also men as well, affect both sides. Now, the way these court cases would play out on screen to us would have some images of the interior of a courthouse being shown, while the quotes that are being said over the audio being displayed as they are said, a lot of them being recited by RBG herself, both in past audio recordings and even in the present of her being interviewed then and now. That is something unique that made me much more engaged with how I would hear each one of these cases play out. In between all of that, the doc also shows how RBG is in her personal life. RBG loves to attend operas. She has a bunch of different collars for her justice robe when she is Associate Justice for the US Supreme Court, and they all look so unique and different. And she also shows how the robes for women are made differently than the ones for men. So she wears different collars for different occasions and moods. To me, I think RBG has a lot of charisma. She is very funny and adds a lot to the humor that this movie, I think, has in spades, as I found myself laughing a lot while watching this documentary. Also, I was laughing in a lot of ironic senses too, as looking at a lot of the court cases in the past, I found it outright ridiculous that gender discrimination or discrimination on the basis of sex was even a thing. A lot of the cases seem relevant to what is happening today with a lot of feminist culture, a lot of future is female kind of thing being a lot more prominent, and RBG is at the center of a lot of this as well. Like I said, the meme culture with this film I was oriented with before I did see this doc. So it was quite amusing to see how some things like the notorious RBG emerge as it happened, and even RBG herself makes it be known that her and Biggie Smalls, aka the Notorious B.I.G., were both born and bred in Brooklyn. So that was funny. She's also seen reacting to Kate McKinnon's impression of her on Saturday Night Live. It's just a bunch of details like these that added on to my high enjoyment of this documentary and me genuinely learning about a figure that I think is now one of the most important people to have ever stood up for women in US history, at least in the 20th century, while also being a force to be reckoned with still in today's day and age. I mean, RBG, again, is in her mid-80s, but shows no sign of stopping. As the documentary also makes clear, she has a weird sleeping schedule. Like, apparently she didn't go to sleep until like 4, 5, 6 in the morning, and somehow is still able to function. That's amazing to me. That's just amazing. Setting aside my enjoyment of the content of this film, I also enjoyed some of the technical merits of this film that did stand out to me, such as the editing, showing off a bunch of archive photos and videos. The direction, I think, from Betsy West and Julie Cohen, I thought was well done in focusing the narrative to RBG's life and career, of course, while also going back and forth between specific arcs, like the marriage between her and Marty, and also some specific court cases. It's all paced together tightly at about 97 minutes, so a little over an hour and a half, but I think this is one of the most engaging hour and a half or so films that I've seen in recent memory, just like Won't You Be My Neighbor. I keep bringing up Won't You Be My Neighbor a lot, as I feel that documentaries like that one and RBG, for having interesting subject matters that they do have, get me so enveloped in what I am watching, because seeing nonfiction is a nice change of pace than seeing fiction on the big screen. And RBG is only the second ever documentary I've seen in theaters, as I said. Some criticism I've seen to this documentary in the few reviews I've seen for it go into how this is a big worshipful portrayal of RBG herself. And for documentaries, or any movies for that matter, they're going to be biased in some sort of way. I mean, for Won't You Be My Neighbor again, for the umpteenth time, that movie is not going to portray Mr. Rogers in a negative light, as it seems like those who were interviewed had nothing bad to say about him, really. So for RBG, really, a lot of good was mentioned about her, though some bad also, with some people mentioning how she was, they didn't like her personality personally. So I would say that the main issue I have with this doc has to do with me wanting more things to be mentioned, or really have some attention brought to them. The more court cases that the doc goes into, the less emphasis they are put on, while also going into how she is in today's day and age. I wish a little bit more of that could have been spotlighted. But even with all of that being said, in this documentary being a look on the life and career of a celebrated Associate Justice for the U.S. Supreme Court, this is an exemplary example of how to do a biographical take in documentary form. Now I've really come to appreciate and admire RBG as a person a lot more, as I think she is an American culture badass, similar to Mr. Rogers for the millionth time, and me mentioning Won't You Be My Neighbor or anything relating to that. But these two documentaries are also kind of connected in how we're going to get feature films soon about these figures being portrayed by some well-known actors as well. With Mr. Rogers, we're getting a biopic about him with Tom Hanks taking on the role of Fred Rogers. And just later this year, actually, we are getting a biopic based on Ruth Bader Ginsburg called On the Basis of Sex, with Felicity Jones starring as RBG herself. In fact, the trailer for that film just dropped a few days ago as I'm recording this review. So yeah, watching that trailer made me more intrigued to see how Jones will portray Ginsburg, and the same thing for Armie Hammer as her husband Marty. But to wrap up my thoughts on the documentary, I think this is a fantastic film. If you can somehow still see this movie in theaters, I say go for it. But if not, this movie actually was announced to have a Blu-ray release come in late August, so I'm pretty sure it will be on streaming services before then. RBG is one of my favorite movies of the year thus far. I highly recommend it. My final verdict for RBG is 4.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of RBG, social media links in the description, subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review. The court is now adjourned.